This week in Davos 2020, they held the World Economic Forum, and they gathered together to mainly talk about climate change. And as you can imagine, anytime anyone gets together to talk about climate change, Greta Thunberg is to be found. Now, I'm not going to make fun of her or talk about her age because I don't really think that's relevant. What is relevant is what she said at this forum and how radical it is. Every time she appears, she says something more and more radical. Don't believe me? Check this out.
Let's be clear. We don't need a low-carbon economy. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degree target. And until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero.
So to really understand what she's saying, we need to know the difference between net zero and real or total zero. When you're talking about emissions, net zero means that you can still emit things as long as you have some way to offset the emissions that you create. For example, you can plant trees because they help to remove some of the emissions from the atmosphere, or we can use a process called carbon removal where they can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere, which I think is pretty awesome, even though it's still in its beginning stages and it's going to get a lot better than it is now. So net zero is something that I think is an ideal goal. It's difficult and we're not even close to getting there, but it's still a goal that I think is worthy. However, what she said is that net zero is no longer enough. Having net zero emissions is not sufficient. We need real zero emissions. What do you think that means? Well, it's pretty simple. Zero total emissions means that we don't emit anything at all. Not that we can offset it, but that you can't emit anything to begin with. Before we look at how ridiculous that is, there are a few things that I want to point out here. First, even if we were looking at net zero emissions, the people who went to the World Economic Forum don't even abide by that. You see, in order to get there, there were an estimated 1,500 private jets traveling to Davos in 2020 for this forum. So Greta Thunberg is trying to hold us to a higher standard than the people who go to this forum are even at. And that just stinks of hypocrisy. But let's be honest, it happens all the time. And I think it's quite hilarious when people who are claiming to talk about the climate and to fight for the climate get to these locations via private jet. Because obviously, that does not help the climate. There's also the fact that this claim that we need to reach total zero is so radical that not even Al Gore himself, the man who created the internet and who was a climate change activist for decades, has said this, as far as I'm aware. He wants a carbon tax and a number of other solutions, but I have not seen him ever call for total zero emissions right now. So Greta Thunberg said something that not even Al Gore himself will support. If not even Al Gore is supporting your climate change solution, it's pretty extreme. Now, in case you think I'm taking this out of context or maybe we're misunderstanding, let's watch one more clip.
We demand at this year's World Economic Forum participants from all companies, banks, institutions and governments immediately halt all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, immediately end all fossil fuel subsidies, and immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. We don't want these things done by 2050, 2030, or even 2021. We want this done now. It may seem like we are asking for a lot, and you will, of course, say that we are naive.
First off, I always appreciate when there are things like this, people say we demand. I don't understand what puts them in a position to demand anything. Like, yes, you can say whatever you want, but saying the terminology we demand does not make it more likely to happen. What she is saying here, just to reiterate, she demands all companies, banks, institutions, and governments to immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. So let's look at that part real quick. Maybe we don't understand what divest is and we're just reading into it a little bit more. So divest just means to deprive someone of power, rights, or possessions, or deprive something of a particular quality. So here, it's fairly evident that divesting from fossil fuels doesn't mean weaning away from it. It doesn't mean let's limit the fossil fuels. It means to deprive completely of fossil fuels. In other words, we need to stop using them entirely. And here's the kicker. She says not by 2050, 2030, or even 2021. We want this done now. Now. You can try to want zero emissions at some point, and that's possible we could get there, I don't know. But to say we want it now, not even by 2021, but literally right now, is not even a dream, it's a dream within a dream. This is Inception level climate change right here. We're not even at the point where we can get zero net emissions, let alone zero total emissions. To give you an idea of why this is literally impossible, all we have to do is look at the things that create emissions. First and foremost, we think about cars. And cars are a pretty big issue, transportation in general. Even some electric cars still emit carbon. So those electric cars would not be good enough. We would somehow have to change every single car in the world for an electric car that does not create any emissions whatsoever. Semi-trucks would also need to be replaced. And in the United States of America, not only are there millions of workers who deal with semi-trucks, but they also transport goods and foods basically all around the country. Without them, you wouldn't really just be able to go to Walmart and pick up anything you wanted because it wouldn't be able to get there. That's not to mention the fact that air travel uses a lot of emissions. How in the world are we going to create an electric airplane right now so that we can not have any emissions when we travel from country to country? I guess whenever this policy enacted, whatever country you're in, that's where you're stuck unless you can walk. That's just transportation though. Believe it or not, electricity is an even bigger issue because 85% of the world's total electricity comes from fossil fuels. 85%. There is no way that we can shift all of that energy directly into something renewable that Greta Thunberg would appreciate anytime in the near future, let alone right now. Also consider the fact that there are many people who rely on fossil fuels for also heating their house. I live in Iowa, and over the past few weeks, we've consistently been below zero. But with wind chill, it's been all the way to -20. Can you imagine living in -20-degree weather without natural gas? I wouldn't be able to heat up my house. How in the world would I live like that? Let's suppose we could somehow immediately, tomorrow, go to zero total emissions, and that most of the rest of the world would follow us. Let's suppose that happens. You know who wouldn't follow us just because Greta Thunberg demands it? Places like China, Russia, and maybe even India, which combined account for 41% of total carbon emissions in the world. So just those 3 countries, if they don't listen to Greta Thunberg, at best, we could cut our emissions down by 59%. And that is assuming absolutely everyone else in the world goes without fossil fuels. Which I do want to point out, if we do that, not only would our economy be ruined and probably the world economy, but you would have China become the new superpower. Is that a world we really want to live in, where China is the one calling the shots on everything? Our economy literally runs on fossil fuels. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't try to decrease it and maybe try to get to net zero, because I think, like I said earlier, that is a worthy goal. But you need to be realistic here. Just because you're scared of climate change and think it's a climate catastrophe does not mean the solution is then to destroy the entire world economy to try and fix it. Our technology is not at the point where we can completely divest from fossil fuels. Not now, probably not even by 2030, probably not even by 2050. Let's be honest here. If you've watched this channel before, you know that I've only made one other video about Greta Thunberg, that I don't want to continually talk about her because I don't really care too much. What is more important than who she is and how old she is the fact that she is consistently brought up as this climate activist who knows what she's talking about, supposedly, and then says stuff like this. Her radicalism is so very clear to anyone with a brain. And because of that, she loses all credibility. You can try and fight for climate change, be a climate change activist, and I'm fine with that. I think that's a worthy goal. But if your solutions are this bad, then you do not deserve the spotlight that you're given. Regardless of your age or gender or anything else, these proposals are not possible solutions whatsoever. We need to acknowledge that and find something else. If you've made it this far and you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a like or a dislike, whatever you want to do. And if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to share them down below in the comment section. Be sure to check out my sources if you have any questions in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.